So it's time to develop our understanding of atomic structure further, and we're going to continue that by our theme of nuclear radiation, and we're going to look particularly at background radiation. But also in this video, we're covering the keywords like dose, irradiation, and contamination. I thought I'd mention now quickly the idea about how we detect radiation. A device called a Geiger-Müller tube is used to detect nuclear radiation, and when it's attached to a counter, it can also be used to measure the activity of a source. And just a quick reminder, 1 becquerel is 1 decay per second. So background radiation, the name kind of draws a picture that you may well associate accurately, but let's all be on the same page about this. Unstable isotopes occur naturally. They're all around us. Because they're all around us, that means there's nuclear radiation all around us all the time. So the radiation given off by sources of nuclear radiation that are around us all the time is called background radiation. Right? There are some natural sources: food, air, space from cosmic rays, and that's things like stars and other things that go on in space that release nuclear radiation that gets brought down to the Earth. Cosmic rays is what causes the aurora borealis and polaris, the northern lights and southern lights. Certain types of rocks also give out either gases themselves or contain radioactive isotopes, so they are naturally radioactive materials in their own right. Artificial ones, the ones that have been caused by humans, fallouts from nuclear incidents, and I'm referring to things like Chernobyl, Fukushima in the more recent history, or the nuclear bombs and the nuclear testing that occurred during the wars and up until modern day. Also, nuclear waste from things like nuclear power stations. The materials produced within the power stations become radioactive because nuclear power stations tend to produce nuclear isotopes which are radioactive. I want to just focus a little bit on the idea of rocks as a natural source. Because the geology of different areas is not the same, the amount of background radiation in different areas is not the same. I managed to pull up a map of where certain types of radiation were more common, and the darker the shading on this map, the more background radiation there is in that area. And you can see from this that Coventry and Birmingham actually not that bad for background radiation. There's a big band that goes across the country, and Wales has quite substantial amounts of it. And if you think about it, certain types of rock in those more mountainous regions are likely to be sources of background radiation. Therefore, that's what causes this difference within this map. Should I be worried? We're absorbing this radiation. Should I be worried? Should I be thinking, oh, I need to move to a different area or a different country in order to get away from these sources of background radiation? Well, the short answer is no. But how do I know that? How do I measure that? And we measure it using dose. A dose is a concept and quantity that we use to measure the risk of harm from being exposed to nuclear radiation. It's measured in sieverts, but a sievert is a big thing. 1 sievert is a lot of nuclear radiation to be exposed to. So most things that we talk about are measured in millisieverts. To put it into context, 5 sieverts, you've got a 50% chance of surviving that. And even then, if you survive it, you're highly likely to be suffering from other forms of radiation sickness, which we'll talk about when we discuss the effects of nuclear radiation shortly. Going on a transatlantic flight is 0.05 millisieverts, so it's a tiny fraction of that. The average UK resident over the course of a year will absorb 2.7 millisieverts worth of radiation. Millisieverts worth of radiation. Tiny in comparison to that 5 sieverts that has this 50% mortality rate. What are the risks of being exposed to nuclear radiation? Ionizing radiation can damage cells when it interacts with the atoms in the cells. That's the ionizing. If either an alpha particle, a beta particle, or gamma ray interact with the atoms in the cells, it can cause them to ionize. That ionization effect can cause it to break compounds, change compounds, and that leads to either tissue damage in small amounts. Potentially, if it hits the DNA within a given cell, it could cause mutation. Now that's more serious because the mutations could lead to the cell reproducing out of control, forming a tumor, and leading to cancer. In larger doses, it's more likely to kill cells completely, cause radiation sickness, and possibly death. Outside the body, beta and gamma radiation are the most dangerous, as they're the most likely to penetrate into the body and be absorbed by tissues and cause damage. Alpha particles can't really get through the skin, so they would have to be very close to the body in order to be stopped by that. Remember also that alpha particles have only got penetration through air of a few centimeters, so they would really have to be up close and to the skin in order to be able to cause any kind of significant damage, and even then it would be damages to your skin layers, which the body can heal quite quickly. Inside the body, alpha is the most dangerous because it will be absorbed by anything around it, so it's going to do a lot of damage in a localized area around where it's absorbed. Beta is less dangerous, but if you've got a long exposure to beta radiation inside the body, it's going to do damage to a larger area because it penetrates through a bit more flesh. Gamma radiation sources within the body are the least dangerous because the radiation will just pass through to the outside. It will go through the tissues because it's less likely to interact with the materials, the atoms inside the tissues. Irradiation. Irradiation is just another way of saying exposed. So if I say something has been irradiated, I'm basically saying it has been exposed to ionizing radiation or nuclear radiation of some form. We're all being irradiated by background radiation all the time. Being irradiated does not make something radioactive. Only changing the isotope involved will make it unstable or make the nucleus unstable, and we'll talk about that when we talk about fission and fusion. At this moment in time though, alpha particles, beta particles and gamma rays are not going to make something radioactive just by interacting with it or being absorbed by it. Okay, now one application of gamma rays that I didn't mention before is in the sterilization of medical equipment or treatment of food in order to prevent it from going bad. Gamma rays in high enough intensities kill living tissues. So if you irradiate something like some fruit, it will kill the microbes on the fruit that might cause decay. So let's irradiate some grapes. There we go. They have been irradiated. They have not, however, become radioactive. Contamination and precautions that we can take to avoid irradiation and contamination. Contamination, it just means that unstable atoms or radioactive isotopes of a material are somewhere they are not wanted to be. Contamination can lead to dangerous levels of exposure or irradiation from those unstable atoms. So we want to avoid that. We want to avoid contamination. We want to avoid excessive irradiation. To do that, we've got a few things that can be done. We store the sources inside lead-lined containers to absorb any errant radiation that we don't want to go anywhere else. We can use shielding and barriers when using sources. If you think about when an X-ray occurs in the dentist, the person doing the X-ray is invariably not in the room with you, and that's because they are minimizing their exposure. They're using that machine day in, day out. They cannot be increasing their dose of radiation, ionizing radiation, whilst those X-rays are being taken. The sources can be handled either remotely or with robots. That's basically to avoid any chance of those materials ending up on your skin or touching you in any way, shape or form, and minimizing the dosage that you receive by handling those sources directly. Also, on the same theme, tongs and gloves can be used to prevent the transfer of any of those materials to the skin. By not touching the source itself, you're not running the risk of contaminating your skin. Protective suits could be worn to prevent breathing in any atoms of these unstable isotopes. In the case of things like Chernobyl and Fukushima, those nuclear incidents released substantial amounts of radioactive isotopes into the air. So breathing suit apparatus and appropriate safety hazard suits were necessary to prevent the people working in those regions taking these radioactive isotopes into their lungs and therefore receiving tissue damage in their lungs from these isotopes giving out the nuclear radiation and dosing up their bodies. Key things to remember from this video: we use Geiger-Müller tubes to detect nuclear radiation. Background radiation is the radiation all around us from different sources, be they natural or human caused. That level varies over time and place. Doses are measured in sieverts and are used to identify the risk of harm from exposure to radiation. The higher your exposure, the more exposure you have, the more likely you are to have harm from that radiation, so your value of dosage in sieverts will increase. Ionized radiation causes harm to living tissues, either in the form of mutation causing cancer or just outright killing cells. If someone's been exposed to it, you've been irradiated. Contamination occurs when unstable atoms get somewhere they're not wanted, and precautions are taken whenever handling or using radioactive sources to minimize the risk of contamination or excessive irradiation, thereby lowering your dose of those types of radiation.